Okay, so this is, let me know if you're not seeing the screen, by the way, seeing integration, jellyfish. This is integrating integrations, and this first part will just be an overview, just what are integrations, that kind of stuff. And then Bobby's going to get into his part, his learnings and his recommendations, suggestions. So first and foremost, kind of just a high-level overview. What are integrations if you don't know, right? We want to make sure everybody's on the same understanding from this, working from the same base. But I'm sure most of you have dealt with an integration in some way or another with Salesforce specifically, and it's just another system that's going to push or pull data into your Salesforce org. So the integration just makes it a lot easier to get the data in and out of the different systems, and allows you as a Salesforce admin to have will be the same as multiple processes in different systems. So we'll show an example of that in a second. But it just allows you kind of process data from one location or from one system into your system, do some stuff with the data, maybe send that data back out in a different way or with additional information back to the host system or the secondary system. So that's just really what we're talking about integrations, two systems coming together to communicate and share data. So here's a couple of examples here. Marketo, if you don't know, is a
marketing automation
tool. I forgot. Marketing automation tool. And, Qualtrics is used a lot with surveys. Zapier is kind of a ETL tool, a light version of ETL, and then Outreach is also, I think, also is sales operations or
sales engagement. Yeah.
Sales engagement. So, they are going to communicate. They're going to each of those items, Outreach, Zapier, Qualtrics, Marketo, etc. Those are their own systems. They're their own. Like you can log into Marketo and you can do a whole bunch of things in Marketo, and you don't need Salesforce necessarily. But when you leverage Salesforce and Salesforce leverages Marketo, you get a lot more power out of those two systems coming together to share data and to use those data, to use that data. So your CRM might be in Salesforce, you send some of that data out to Marketo, it does email blasting, some other things, sends back information like this user doesn't want to subscribe anymore, or this user had activity. It can create tasks and do things like that. Qualtrics is surveys. So again, you have a bunch of users in your survey, or a bunch of contacts in your Salesforce. You send that information over to Qualtrics. Qualtrics is really good at processing surveys, building surveys. The survey builders live in Qualtrics. They analyze in Qualtrics, but sometimes you got to get some of that information back into Salesforce just so you're just have it in your CRM. So how do they kind of communicate? They use API. So let's kind of go through this. What is an API? It's a mechanism. Anyway, it's basically a language that kind of how do I say it? It's a translator between the two systems. It's a common language that the two systems speak, comes together, and basically allows them to interact with each other. And I have an example. The way that I remember integrations is, or APIs, is I think of it as diner slang. If you're familiar with diner slang, like I've never been to a diner like this, but if you go to a TV diner, if you're on a TV show and they're in a diner, they always have strange phrasings for ordering food. So I have an example. So if the waitress says, "Give me a Ripper, make it cry, and a bowl of red in the alley," the chef knows that the person has ordered a deep fried hot dog with onions, a bowl of red chili, chili con carne, and a bowl of chili con carne on the side. So that's what that translates to. So the waitress is translating your order of a hot dog with a bowl of chili with onions to the chef, who might be the other system, and she's the intermediary there. So that's how I think of it in that way. So please forgive me. The other thing that you want to consider when you're thinking about these integrations is this principle of least privilege. And what that means is that you don't need to have every single system that you have receiving all of the information from your Salesforce org. You also don't need your Salesforce org to receive all the information from the source system. So Marketo doesn't need to send you every single interaction but maybe you have certain interactions you want them to send. Qualtrics doesn't need all of your opportunity data because it's just a survey platform. It doesn't need opportunity data. So the principle of least privileges means that you're going to limit the access that's there. The other thing that you want to do that's a best practice is you want one integration user in your Salesforce org per integration that you have with the outside system. And the reason for that, one of the primary reasons for that is security, number one. So the least amount of access given. If you have one user for you have one integration user for all of your integrations, well, you have to open up your permissions for that particular user to accommodate all of the potential needs of the other systems and all of the potential communications of all the other systems. So that is not least privilege. That is one user, all privileges, right? So you don't want to do
It's
that.
also hard to tell what's updating what if it's used for multiple integrations.
Right.
And then if you give an integration more access than it needs to, it can sometimes really bog down that integration because it's continually updating fields and things that it doesn't actually need access to.
Exactly, yes. So from a security perspective, if something goes haywire, you can't shut down that integration user because you can, but you end up shutting it down for all of it. That turns off that one user to all users. But if you know that something's wrong with your Zapier integration, it's doing crazy stuff. Well, you can just kind of freeze that user or disable that user account, and that'll cut off the communication and it'll put a freeze, and you can now identify what's going on. So here's an example of least privilege right here. So Outreach might need access to object X, but it doesn't need access to objects A, B, or Z. But Zapier does need access to all the objects A, B, X, and Z, but it doesn't need specific fields like A20 or B10, right? So that's kind of this example of why you would have one user per integration and you would just only open up access to the various objects and fields that are only needed for those particular integrations. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bobby. He's going to take it from here, and yeah, that's it. So Bobby, let me know when you need me to advance the slide. Otherwise, I will just say hello, welcome.
Cool, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Bobby. I'm a Salesforce administrator for a company called Sisense. It's a business intelligence software, like a competitor with Tableau, Power BI, stuff like that. Long story short, we've got 20 to 30 integration users dedicated in our org right now. As you can imagine, once you start doing the math, that is taking up a lot of money, and our company recently renegotiated our Salesforce contract and reduced our license count. So it became this issue of a nice to have and transitioned into a necessary to do. So I'm kind of in the process of this project right now. I think the documentation is maybe not as good as it could be. There's a lot of confusion, and a lot of people seem to be unclear on how to go about converting their licenses over to the API license. I don't want to call myself like any kind of an expert or someone who knows everything on the topic, but I'm kind of knee deep in the project right now. I think we've got about 15 integrations over as of today and still a handful more to go. So I'm going to just kind of share some of the things I've noticed over time, but if you guys have anything at the end that you want to ask about or anything that you can contribute, you're definitely encouraged to do so, because it feels like I continue to learn new stuff about this pretty much every week. So yeah, I'll dive right into it. Oh, and also if you suggest any topics to Michael for any future meetings, just know he's probably going to volunteer you to also speak. So here we are.
You're welcome.
All right, you can go ahead and hop into these slides. Cool. So the first one here is just kind of like the basic first few steps that we take to set it up. We start with switching the actual user over to the Salesforce integration user license type. And then we go to the profile and switch that over to the minimum access. Or you can switch it over to Salesforce API only system integration. That's the one that we've been going with in our org. But once you switch those over, I think a key step that I didn't read everywhere, but that I've seen kind of come up as an issue for a lot of people is that you need to add a Salesforce API integration permission set license. So when you actually open up permission set licenses on that user after updating the license and profile, you'll see this third image here that Michael has on the slide. There's just this little checkbox. So yeah, make sure you go in there, check that box, and then really that's the initial setup phase. What comes next is the grueling manual part of manually building out your permission set and determining what permissions or what objects, what fields need access here, and additional things in there like Apex, custom permissions, custom settings, stuff like that. You want to go ahead and hop to the next slide. Oh, sorry. One other thing I would say really quick, when we're creating the actual permission set, the initial permission set that we're going with, we want to add on that permission set the option to make it eligible by license. So there is a Salesforce API integration license option when you're actually creating the permission set on that creation screen. So be sure to click that on the initial permission set that you create. But as I kind of dive into this a little bit further, we've found there's some things that aren't allowed on the initial permission set. So you have to create a second oftentimes to account for that. And I know this is a mouthful and there's a lot of words being thrown out there, license and API and integration over and over and over. So bear with me and we can try and answer questions and give examples at the end if we need to. So for support documentation, this is a big one I've noticed. A lot of the clients that you're going to be working with for these integrations, a lot of them have, somewhat good documentation about objects, fields, custom permissions, things from their packages that you want to include for any integrated user. This is going to be key for a lot of you if you're undertaking this project, because a lot of the integration partners we've spoken with have no clue this license type even exists, or if they do know that it exists, they haven't really taken the plunge into developing for that yet, making any kind of process aware for their end users of how to switch to this license. So we've encountered most of the time that we need to speak with support. They give us the bad news, and then we have to go into documentation, pick apart as many permissions as we can find initially, and then kind of test and repeat from there until we can get things to work as we want it to. Gonna hop to the next slide, Michael. So with the API license, the main thing here is that you don't get any UI access. So normally with our integration users, maybe if you want to test something, we'll just log in as that integration user, click around Salesforce, do what we need to do. However, with this new license type, you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to do anything within the UI. And a lot of times that includes authentication. So with a lot of these integrations, the setup process may be pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But if you've already switched your license type over to the API license, when you click authenticate, some of them will throw an error to you saying that you essentially can't reach that login screen, that login portal. So a workaround that we found here is authenticating just as like a sysadmin profile initially. And then after that is successful, going back to the user in Salesforce, updating it to the API only license, giving it the permission sets that it needs, and then testing from there. So we've had success so far. We had a few integrations that were not cooperating until we attempted to do this workaround essentially. So yeah, we've also found that thankfully, most of our integrations are already authenticated. So once we've done our testing in Sandbox or elsewhere, when it comes time to switch over to Salesforce production, we don't have to re-authenticate a lot of the time because that's already taken care of. We just need to update the permissions. So that's a key thing you probably want to focus on when you are testing in some kind of sandbox environment is, as much as you can get right there is going to help a lot more in the long run once you get into production. Can hop to the next one. Yeah, so license count. This may seem like kind of an edge case to some of you, but I thought it was important to mention because a lot of companies might look to shift their contracts with Salesforce now that they have the new integration license. Our company did this, reduced the user count, except for us admins weren't totally aware of what our new license count was going to be with Salesforce. So when that initially happened, it put us in the negative by a few licenses. And Salesforce gives you a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of time to get your contract back in compliance, which isn't a huge deal. However, when we would switch one of our integrations over to the new API license, you're then barred from switching it back, to a regular Salesforce sysadmin license because you're in the negative count. So that was a big whoopsie we had for the first day or two, just making sure we get our users sorted and get our license back in compliance with our license counts. So make sure that if you're doing any contract negotiations or shifting licenses around to pay attention to your license count, just so you don't end up in a difficult situation there. All right, so a lot of the integrations that you're going to be coming across come with a basic managed package. A lot of these packages are going to have permission sets already built for you. They're going to have most of what you need and going to make your life a lot easier. However, if any of these managed package permission sets come with a Visualforce, with any Visualforce access in them, you're not going to be able to assign that to your user once it has the API only license. So a workaround to that we found is, since the integration is a lot of times just passing that data through, what we could do is just clone those managed package permission sets. And once we clone them, they become custom, right? So then on our custom cloned permission set, we'll just go in to the Visualforce page access and uncheck all the boxes in there so it's totally clear. And then more often than not, we can go forward with assigning that to the API user, integration user. All right, this is a tricky one that's it's pretty simple in theory, but threw us for a loop for a little while. If you've ever worked with install packages and connected apps, some of you may know that there's an option to, as you can see in the first image here, let all users self-authorize when working with this integration between the two systems. Or there's a second option to have pre-approved profiles. So say maybe you have, some kind of a budgeting tool or something like that, and you only want admins and maybe finance or somebody to access that tool, you can go into admin pre-approved users and just put those profiles in there, maybe finance, admin, something like that. What we noticed is that we did have a handful of our connected apps with admin pre-approved profiles. However, the Salesforce API profile does not by default update for you. So we had to go into all of our connected apps, and anywhere that we had admin pre-approve to authorize, we had to go into every single one of those make sure that we updated the Salesforce API only integration user to be pre-approved. And that was a hurdle that we faced a few times. And the next step is going to kind of, I think, dive into the workaround we initially had for that. So when we started hitting roadblocks on a couple of these, it was sort of a matter of like just guess and check, because there's only so much you can do when the client doesn't have updated documentation and you're really just kind of spitballing. So what we started thinking is like, okay, Apex or API, these are probably like two keywords here that are going to be playing a part here. So we started looking in system permissions. There's the use any API client permission in the permission sets. So we added that, and a couple of our permission or integrations started working correctly once we did that. And once we were reading more into this permission, thinking like, okay, on one hand, we're glad it works. On the other hand, what the hell does this do? Hopefully, we're not opening Pandora's box. Once we read into that a little bit more, we realized that sort of helps you bypass admin pre-approved profiles for these connected apps. So if if all else fails and you're like really up against it and can't get anything to transfer between two systems, this is one permission that I can maybe recommend throwing out there just to see while you're testing if things will work, if you can bypass it. Because if that's the case, then it is capable of using that API connection to transfer data. You just have to figure out if there's something blocking it or if there's a better way to do it.
So this was kind of your like Hail Mary, or it can be used as a Hail Mary for somebody who thinks everything's working as it should be, but just nothing's flowing.
Yeah, we had a couple that it seemed like everything was perfect. There's no reason why I shouldn't be communicating. And after the fact, we realized we didn't have the approved profile for the connected app. But yeah, we just hit like Control F, search API and system permissions, and it was like, okay, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. Okay, we don't have this checked, not really familiar with it, and it's, pretty wide access as a permission. So let's just test it since we're in the sandbox anyways and see what happens. So for us, it at least helps us like know we can move forward. But it's not something that we leave on all of our permissions necessarily.
Right. You don't want to
Could
leave
it be an
looks like
issue?
modify all data. Okay.
I was just thinking, could it be an issue if you have login IP ranges and you kind of force people to log in through the IP ranges and you don't have the IP range set up for your integration user?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, for us, if you look at the wording that goes with the system permission, it like specifically refers to the pre-approved users from the previous slide. But yeah, we haven't looked into anything with the IP ranges regarding this yet.
I asked because we had a client that we use this permission because of the login IP ranges, but it wasn't due to the license type. But yeah.
Well, good to know. It's another potential reason to use a Hail Mary once in a while when you're testing.
Yeah.
All right. So in addition to Apex, I have one other thing on here that I can touch after, but essentially, when you look at your permission set that has the API license as a requirement, you're not going to be able to select Apex class access on there. And I don't know why that is. That's just the way that the permission sets are built. One thing we found is just creating another permission set with no license requirement on it, and then going into Apex, essentially adding any of the relevant classes, especially if it comes from, a package from the integrated partner. And you can go into your packages, by the way, if you aren't aware, and search like all the components that came in with them and see, sometimes that helps to troubleshoot and see, okay, this package came with some Apex classes, custom permissions, whatever it might be. And then you can go into the second permission set with no license requirement, add your Apex classes, add custom permissions, and then you can assign that to the API user. We did have another permission or another integration that seemed pretty much solid across the board and everything was working except like one little bit of information wasn't transferring, wasn't passing through, and wasn't updating as we expected. And after a little bit of playing around, we realized like, okay, yeah, this package comes with Apex. We couldn't assign that on this API license permission set, but with a new permission set, we could do so, and that takes care of the problem. And a lot of times,
Oh.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say there was a question actually in the chat from John that was related to this, and like, what is the advantage of assigning a license to the permission sets you add to the integration users? So I was curious about that too, actually. Like, do you even need to have a
Yeah,
permission set?
that's a great question. I am not 100% sure on the answer to that one, to be honest with you. It's one that I think is interesting because if it doesn't contribute anything, then why is the option even there? Um, it's sort of the path that we've been using, and I've seen it recommended and suggested a lot by other users and a little bit in documentation. I honestly don't know, can't give you a great reason as to why it is there and why it's used. But we use it as the base license permission set and use it as much as we can. And then we do another permission set if we end up having to add extra things that aren't compatible with it. So yeah, sorry I can't give you a good answer there. I'm not totally sure on that one yet.
Yeah, to me, it seems like maybe the intention is to prevent you from adding things that it's not compatible with, but then there's things that it needs that it is compatible with that's not included. So it's
Right,
just bizarre.
right, because yeah, when you create that, you don't have the ability to add visual force to that, right? So that's a good thing. But I agree. I think the confusion lies in, okay, well, we've had to add Apex and a couple of custom permissions to some of these. So why aren't those allowed in this? But the user can accept it, right? It's very strange. I don't know. I think that's probably the reason why you would imagine, but I'm not sure why you can't just add Apex and custom permissions to the base permission set. It's weird. All right. Yeah, I think that's everything that I had off the top of my head here and in the notes here. Thanks for hearing me out. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or comments or any experience of their own, I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, Michael, Allison, if you guys have anything, please take the floor.
I mean, go ahead. Jonathan has a question. Go ahead, John.
Hey, so I'm representing a vendor, nonprofit vendor with an app, and we have not, as you were describing, dipped our toes into this one yet because we're scared of it. It looks like our needs are actually going to be pretty small, but I'm kind of wondering, because if we can do it, we'd love to, if you've had any experience with any other vendors building out API user-friendly licenses, permission sets, and like trying to package them, or if it really does have to be done from scratch by the end user.
To be honest, with like all the integrations we've done, the handful that were even aware of the license type didn't have any specific custom API only permissions built out. It was usually the case of if there was already permissions that were provided, what I said earlier, we would just clone them and remove all the visual force and check and see if everything else looked good in there. But yeah, that if you've already got some permissions, that may be like a path of least resistance for you too, is just removing visual force and a couple other things and trying to copy from there.
That makes sense. Okay, thanks. And yeah, thanks for the overview too. This is all really helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Grant, did you want to?
Yeah, I happen to have my dev org open, and I've worked with these with a few integrations at this point. I've done it for Marketo and Outreach, and now we've been working on it for HubSpot recently. And when I just tried to add a permission set that did not have a license assigned, because the permission set included Visualforce page access, it then threw an error.
Yeah.
So it's it's probably
Yeah.
just, as far as the previous question, I mean, it seems like it's just about preventing incompatible permissions from being added, so you can be a little more certain of what will work, I guess.
Right.
That's interesting that Apex class, like obviously the things need Apex class access.
Yeah, and to be clear on that, that was an integration with Synergify, which is like a connector between Salesforce and Jira. And we were essentially able to update things in Jira, and it wasn't updating everything we wanted it to in Salesforce as expected. But then after adding the Apex classes from the Synergify package, everything started working again like instantaneously. So, but yeah.
Yeah, I know too, like we were looking at it for lean data, and lean data's default permission sets include Visualforce pages. So you could just clone, like you had said, the permission sets, remove the Visualforce pages.
And
There
we've
you go.
definitely found
But-
a lot of these partners don't, like, they tell you right out of the gate it's not compatible. And
Right.
it's like, well, it is compatible. You just need to clone the permission set because like it's just passing the data. So most of the time it doesn't need Visualforce. So even if they tell you it's not compatible, don't shy away from testing if you have the free time.
So it's not compatible with how they want to set up their permission sets and package it over to you with all the pieces in one permission set. It's, in a way, it's compatible because you've gone and taken out the pieces that don't apply or can't be applied, and it just kind of
Yeah.
works in that way as well.
It's just weird that
So-
that license type doesn't include like you can't just add Apex classes and things that are in the other permission set license type.
Yeah, I think Apex
Yeah.
and custom permissions or custom
Yeah.
settings, whatever. Those are like the two main ones that we have had to go back and add in a second set.
Was there just Chris? It looks like Christopher's raising your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, two questions. I may have missed this earlier because I was grabbing some dinner, had to step away. But is the reason that the API integration license it being pushed out there, is it less expensive than
It's
some of the
way
regular
way
licenses?
more
I see
affordable.
a lot of nodding heads here.
It's like $10 a license.
Okay.
And you
It
get
is
5 for
free, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So that makes sense why it's getting more and more popular and wanting people to use it. The other question I had was more on, and again, this may be because I just have not done very many integrations, but I did a ZoomInfo and a LinkedIn Sales Navigator integration, two different integrations. Both of them require a secondary authentication for the specific user. So the user, when they're logged into Salesforce, they're going to see the leads and stuff that if they were logged into ZoomInfo, say, they would see outside of ZoomInfo. LinkedIn Navigator is similar. So there would be the integration license and permission set, and then the user authentication. Does this would this be something you would you use the API in this case, or would you still use the older, or the older style of integration user, or at all?
Well, you're referring, sorry, I'm gonna jump in. When you talk about Sales Navigator, that's a per person kind of a thing, right? That's where your sales reps are pulling, scraping, getting data from LinkedIn into your Salesforce through that connection. Is that correct, or is this?
Yeah.
Or is there an
another way
actual
that they do that?
user that does updating?
There's usually an actual user. What happened is the person would have to be logged into their, say, ZoomInfo account, and when they're logged into the Salesforce account, so Salesforce would see that authentication.
Right. So yeah. So in that scenario that you're talking about, in that scenario that you're describing, that individual user would authenticate through their own connections. So I myself would log into LinkedIn Navigator as myself, and none of the kind of, you wouldn't have to deal with any of those integration user kind of pieces.
Okay.
It's just going to be me. It's a one connection. I am giving LinkedIn access to my Salesforce, and all the permissions that I have as a user in Salesforce. But if Salesforce was going to talk directly to LinkedIn and just pull down the boatloads of data from LinkedIn as not myself, or almost as an administrator, there might be I don't think this exists.
I think
they didn't really have a bulk thing. It was, I mean, they literally had to buy individual licenses for LinkedIn Sales Navigator or ZoomInfo, and then all of those people who were in Salesforce, they had Salesforce licenses, so there were already licenses on either end. So, and I don't remember setting up an integration user for this.
Right. No, those are one-to-one user. Go ahead.
Okay.
It could depend too, because like there's certain tools like SalesLoft, for example, where each salesperson has, they authenticate through their user and their activities get logged in the context of their Salesforce user. But then there might be automation that you set up with the SalesLoft integration user that then updates like fields and things like that. So it could be something like that where, yes, there's users that are authenticating using their user, but then there's some like admin portion of it that's still using it.
It's pulling in bulk data at a certain point. Okay.
Yeah, and ZoomInfo works the same way too.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
LinkedIn Navigator doesn't do that particularly. It doesn't have that admin piece to it. It's just a one-to-one. But a lot of the other tools do have this like behind-the-scenes business operations or sales operations kind of a user.
That's all I have. Thank you.
I just wanted to touch back, since this is recording, it'll go out on the internet, hopefully. Just to recap about the $5 license, and you get $10 license, whatever the cost is. But the whole thing came up. I think it was Sales Dreamforce 21 or 22, and at the true to the core, if you haven't gone to Dreamforce or you haven't gone to a Trailhead DX or an in-person, there is a section that is called True to the Core. It allows you to go up there and basically ask whatever you want of high-level product managers, and I think the CFO is there, or CTO is also there, and they'll just take your questions. They don't care, and they'll push the question off usually, but they usually answer it for the most part. One of the questions that a user said was, Salesforce recommends that every integration has its own user license. And that's great, we want to do that, but your user licenses cost $300 per seat per month. And that's expensive. So can we have a license that's cheaper? And so they did. So they created the API integration user, and that's $5 a month or whatever it is. But again, it only gives you the non-UI thing. So that's where that came from. So every org now has, I think, 5 free in there. So if you go into your license, into your company info, you can look at your license type, and you should see 5 integration users, and you can buy more in packs of, I don't know, Bob, are they 10 or 5 or something like that?
Something like that, yeah.
All right. any other questions or comments or thoughts? Any other help needed? Well, I'm gonna wrap up the recording, then we'll go ahead, Bobby.
I was going to say, I think Outreach is one of the integrations we're about to be evaluating. So if you guys want some extra hours, no.
Yeah, it worked for me with Outreach.
That's good. Good to know.
Cool. All right. Well, I do want to thank Bobby for suggesting it and for putting it together as well as participating. Seriously, thank you very much. We'll reach out to you in a bit to get over to your place and drop off a goodie bag. So prepare. So that'll wrap it up for this. I'm going to wrap up the recording and then we'll finish up the meeting. But this will go wrap up the recording now. So I'm going to go ahead and stop and just say thank you again, Bobby. Connect with Bobby. Is it okay if people connect with you on LinkedIn or not?
Go for it. Go crazy.
All the good things, all the places. All right. So his link will be in the notes as well as the wrap up. So thanks again to everybody for coming out, and thank you again to Bobby. Really do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank